Have you ever wondered why so many signs seem to align at once, as if someone were plotting an invisible roadmap for the days ahead? If you think the world's signs are random, wait until you see how Mary's 7 messages draw a map, not a geographic map, but a spiritual one for navigating the tribulation. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. These aren't just dramatic warnings, but practical calls to conversion, inner preparation, and family care. Throughout this journey, we'll talk about the unrevealed messages circulating among believers and scholars, and how these indications can serve as reference points when everything around us seems uncertain. Have you ever experienced a night when all seemed lost, and suddenly a word, a sign, or a prayer brought clarity? This is the experience that Mary's messages seek to provoke, a profound awakening that guides us through trials, purifications, and, above all, a promise of hope. In this video, we will unravel, step by step, each of Mary's 7 messages, examining signs in heaven and on earth, the call to personal conversion, family as a refuge, and practical spiritual preparation. I won't engage in empty theories or sensationalism. I will point out concrete clues so you can learn to read this secret map with discernment, without panic. There will be scenes, stories, and examples that connect these messages to contemporary events, climate change, social crises, and signs that many ignore, always seeking to separate what stems from fear from what stems from the call to action. I want you to feel that you are not alone on this journey. Many people who have heard these messages have found practice and comfort by putting into practice simple prayers, fasting, and acts of charity. And if you've ever felt a restlessness in your chest when you see headlines, natural disasters, or moral collapses, know that this restlessness may be the first point on the map, the wake-up call that alerts you to the need for spiritual reorientation. Throughout the introduction, I'll use terms like secret map of the tribulation, 7 messages from Mary, Medjugorje, and unrevealed messages naturally, because they are keywords that help us stay focused on what really matters, living our faith in the present. I also want to provoke a sincere reflection. What would you be willing to change in your life if you realized there was a spiritual script demanding an answer? Stay with me until the end of this series, because in the next parts, we'll detail each message with images, testimonies, and practical guidance you can apply today. As you observe, think of a small action you can begin now: a prayer, a request for reconciliation, a gesture of family care, simple things that move the heart, and that, according to these messages, have real power in the face of storms. What you discover now may surprise you and, at the same time, give you peace to face uncertainty. Without ending anything here, I invite you to open your heart. In the next scenes, we will begin to trace the first point of this secret map, a sign of awakening that can change the way you see the signs around you. As you experience all of this, I want to invite you to actively participate in this conversation, not as a distant spectator, but as part of a community seeking discernment and support. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what touched you most, what sign you've noticed in your life or in your family, and how you reacted. Sharing your experience may help someone else see a point on the map they hadn't noticed before. Your participation isn't just a comment, it's a gesture of courage that strengthens those also searching for answers. If this video is helping you better understand the secret map of the tribulation and the 7 messages of Mary, click the like button. This simple sign shows that the content resonates with you and encourages the creation of more videos with research, testimonies, and practical guidance. And if you want to continue following this series, subscribe to the channel. That way you'll ensure you don't miss the next installments, where we'll unravel each message of Medjugorje with more detail, images, and real testimonies. Your subscription and likes expand the reach of this work and allow us to reach more people who need to hear these warnings and promises. This isn't advertising, it's a sincere call. Together, by commenting, liking, and subscribing, we build a support network that transforms anxiety into action. Stay with me. Next, we'll begin to trace the first point on this map, the wake-up call, and I want to read what you share as we go. You've heard of Medjugorje, but perhaps you don't know who the true people behind the apparitions are, nor the historical and spiritual weight these messages carry. Medjugorje is a small village in Bosnia-Herzegovina where, since 1981, several people have claimed to have received apparitions of the Virgin Mary. The visionaries, men and women who reported these experiences, have become voices that, for many believers, serve as beacons in times of doubt and affliction. These aren't just isolated stories, but rather recurring accounts, with similar patterns of calls to prayer, repentance, and life change. This is why the so-called 7 unrevealed messages spark so much interest. They circulate among communities, find their way into theological studies, and stir the minds of those seeking signs and hidden truth. What I'm going to propose here isn't an exercise in sensationalism, but a careful look behind the scenes of this tradition, the witnesses, the repercussions, and the real impact these warnings have had on entire families and communities. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and it's important to clarify what we mean by authority and discernment. When we talk about Medjugorje and the messages attributed to the Virgin, we're not just dealing with mystical narratives. There's also a social and human fabric that underpins these experiences. People who have transformed their lives, communities that have reorganized around prayer, charitable initiatives that were born from a simple inner calling. These tangible effects, transformation of habits, shifting moral decisions, realigning priorities, are part of why this topic deserves serious attention. Some scholars catalog the messages, others gather testimonies, and there are also those who skeptically investigate the historicity of the accounts. This dialogue between faith and inquiry forms the space where the hidden truth, if it exists, can be better understood. The point is that the messages, even when analyzed critically, produce an impact. They change lives, provoke conversions, and activate spiritual practices that, for many, serve as anchors in times of crisis. As we approach these 7 unrevealed messages, we will observe that they do not come as ready-made doctrines, but as invitations to a journey that demands inner transformation before any external preparation. That's why I insist on the word transformation. It's not just about stockpiling food or seeking refuge. It's about changing our mindset, prioritizing love, remaking decisions that were based on pride or disgust, and rediscovering a simplicity of life capable of withstanding trials. And when I say decisions, I mean the small daily choices that define character and direction. A word of forgiveness, an act of service, a gesture of reconciliation. These small decisions, accumulated, form a practical map of spiritual survival. The messages, told by those who lived them, seem to point to this kind of preparation. Practices of prayer, reconciliation, fasting, and, above all, a return to family. As a nucleus of support and refuge, there's also a revelatory component that needs to be treated carefully. Not every apparition or report is clear or uniform. There are divergences, diverse interpretations, and even rumors fueled by fear. Therefore, it's essential to distinguish between authentic signs and sensationalism. Discernment is a necessary skill, a way of discerning that separates fleeting emotion from solid conviction. And it's precisely at this threshold that the narrative becomes fascinating. Seeing how communities that decided to live by these messages experienced real impact, finding peace amidst unrest and building support networks that sustain faith in everyday life. These behind-the-scenes stories, the stories of families who gathered to pray, of people whose lives changed after a personal encounter with the message, are the seeds of transformation that demonstrate the practical power of these warnings. Furthermore, there is a social factor that amplifies interest in these messages. The collective sense that we are living in times of transition, climate change, political crises, and a kind of cultural acceleration lead many to seek meaningful answers. In this context, the Medjugorje messages appear to some as a symbolic roadmap, a cartography of signs that helps interpret events. This does not make the messages a scientific explanation for everything that happens, but it does attribute to them a guiding function, helping to shape a mindset prepared to face trials without losing hope. The narrative that emerges is, therefore, twofold: at once a warning and a promise, a challenge and a comfort. Those who listen with an open heart can experience inner revelations that reconfigure priorities, motivate personal reforms, and mobilize concrete acts of compassion. As we approach the content of these messages, it's important to maintain a balance between curiosity and prudence. Curiosity drives us to explore testimonies, understand contexts, and recognize patterns. Prudence protects us from hasty conclusions and interpretations that fuel panic. The approach I propose here is one of careful examination, listening to stories, comparing trends, perceiving community impact, and, above all, seeking what bears fruit: real change, reconciliation, and increased faith. There are abundant accounts of people who have found new meaning in life in the call to prayer and forgiveness. There are also voices that call for calm, study, and introspection before drawing radical conclusions. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, delving into the origins of these accounts and the lives of the visionaries, understanding how each message connects with human experience and how, in everyday life, they transform into concrete practices of faith. With this, we will begin to trace the connections between each spiritual prescription and the signs many claim to have seen in the world, a map that is as internal as it is external, as much of the heart as of reality. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. What we call the secret map is not a cartographic instruction with routes and coordinates, but rather a set of symbolic reference points that, when read sensitively, point to possible paths through the tribulation. Imagine a map made of signs and attitudes, where each fold of paper represents a human experience, a natural phenomenon that shocks, a social crisis that erodes trust, a gesture of forgiveness that reconfigures a family. These points do not appear in isolation, they form patterns. Perceiving these patterns requires a shift in mindset, abandoning the fragmented view of events and accepting the idea that there is an underlying symbolic structure that invites us to transformation. It is not an abstract theory, it is a practical way of life. The so-called hidden truth that many seek is not necessarily a conspiratorial secret, but the discovery that certain decisions, repeated over time, produce a concrete spiritual impact. In other words, the map works both externally and internally, signs in heaven and on earth, dialogue with intimate movements of the heart. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, and this is where the metaphor takes on practical form. Think of the map as composed of nodes and routes. The nodes are the strong signusa sequence of weather storms, a local economic collapse, an emergence of moral tensions that draw collective attention. The roots are the human responses recommended by the messages: prayer, reconciliation, fasting, the practice of charity, reordering family priorities. Following a route doesn't mean avoiding suffering, but having a reference point that guides decisions when circumstances become adverse. True preparedness, according to these signs, has much more to do with habits and attitudes than with stockpiles or bunkers. Daily transformation, made up of small choices, is what alters the map's outline and strengthens communities to overcome trials. To read this map with discernment, we need to adjust the lens through which we observe events. First, separate emotion from conviction. An extreme climate phenomenon can mobilize us with panic, but it can also summon us to rethink our relationship with creation. Therein lies the call to responsibility and ecological conversion. Second, assess personal and collective impact. The same message that touches one person may bear different fruit in another. The secret map is not prescriptive in the mechanistic sense. It is a call to action. Third, seek patterns of coherence in the witnesses and the fruits. Communities that have embraced the suggested practices: regular prayer, family gatherings, acts of charity often show greater emotional and social resilience, which, from a practical perspective, serves as evidence that these guidelines produce real impact. The behind-the-scenes nature of the apparitions and narratives also deserves attention. Among the visionaries, there are stories of inner lives, crucial decisions, and renunciations that echo in everyday life. Often, behind a public message, there is an intimate process of conversion that involves concrete choices: leaving a job that erodes peace, forgiving someone who caused pain, prioritizing listening to family over unbridled consumption. These small gestures, taken together, make up the experiential map that the messages point to. When we speak of revelations, therefore, we are dealing with both what is said aloud and what is experienced in silence. And it is in this silence that the hidden truth often blossoms. Another essential point is the relationship between external signs and inner state. Some people seek only spectacular signs, lights in the sky. Rare phenomenon lose sensitivity to the signs that truly transform: more fraternal behavior, a decision to reconcile, a prayer routine that resists fatigue. The secret map indicates that lasting change comes from the encounter between interiority and action. Therefore, the messages do not favor sensationalism. Rather, they invite us to cultivate a life of coherence. The mindset recommended by this map is one of serene vigilance, moral readiness, and attention to community ties. Instead of promoting fear, the proposal is to reorient priorities. Less anxiety about what we lose, more care for what we keep: love, faith, forgiveness. At the same time, there is an epistemological challenge: how to validate signs and reports without falling into naivete or extreme skepticism. The answer requires practice, listening to reports with humility, testing the results, dialoguing with those who live in community, and consulting reliable sources. Discernment is not a magical skill. It is a cultivated discipline. It involves a careful reading of events, dialogue with spiritual tradition, and a willingness to change course when the evidence so recommends. This process brings progressive revelations, not always spectacular, but powerful in their effective spiritual reconstruction. The stories of community members who reorganized their lives around prayer and mutual care are concrete examples of impact and constitute clues to the map that is not limited to texts, but lives in practices. The journey proposed by this secret map, therefore, is not escapism nor an invitation to paranoia. It is a call to a life with a clearer purpose, shaped by decisions that, though small, have cumulative power. In practical terms, this means reinvesting time in family dialogue, establishing regular practices of silence and prayer, prioritizing reconciliation where there is division, and maintaining critical attention to information that distorts or amplifies fear. The necessary transformation is twofold: personal and communal. By transforming intimate habits, we create more resilient social networks. By reorganizing collective priorities, we mitigate social impacts. Thus, the map ceases to be merely a concept and becomes a life script, a practical cartography for those who wish to navigate trials with dignity and faith. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, exploring how each node on this map connects with concrete signs that many report seeing, and how the suggested routes apply to real life in the daily lives of individuals and families. With that, we'll begin to sketch out, point by point, How this map works in practice, observing both the coincidences and divergences between reports and consequences. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and begin with the first node of this secret map, the awakening sign. This sign doesn't arrive as an apocalyptic flash simply to provoke fear. It manifests, first, as a collective unrest, a subtle movement that alters mindsets and prompts small but decisive decisions. Imagine a community where people begin to question meaning again, seek out prayer groups, return to practices they had previously neglected. Out of routine or convenience, this return, almost always timid at first, is one of the clearest signs that an awakening is underway. It's not necessarily spectacular, but it has a real impact. More confessions, more family gatherings around the prayer table, renewed volunteerism in local initiatives. These are practical clues that demonstrate transformation taking place in everyday life. The awakening sign also reveals itself through conversations that return to values, priorities that shift. People who previously prioritized consumption, image, or success begin to redefine goals. Routine decisions like forgiving, reconciling, or reducing excesses take on new weight. The hidden truth here, and it's a truth that many Medjugorje accounts seem to confirm, that the most effective preparation is not just material, but moral and spiritual. A family that decides, for example, to establish a daily moment of silence and prayer, or that returns to eating together and talking about faith, begins to build existential immunity in the face of trials. This is a concrete impact, a change in habits that alters the course of relationships and emotional resilience. There are also signs behind the scenes at institutions: the growth of spiritual formation movements, the emergence of retreats, an increase in requests for spiritual direction and guidance from religious leaders. Sometimes, a nearly silent movement emerges of people exchanging social media for in-person meetings. Other times, a wave of dream reports and personal signs appears, pushing individuals toward a more intense search. These phenomena, when observed together, paint a pattern that points to awakening. Let's not mistake fleeting sensations for a signal. The coherence and persistence of the fruits is what should draw our attention. In other words, the map asks us to look for trends, not isolated noise. Another powerful indicator is the reactivation of community care. When the message sparks concrete charitable actions, groups that organize aid for the most vulnerable, neighborhoods that become support networks, initiatives that prioritize sharing, then we see a mature response to the call. The transformation these actions produce tends to be multiplier. Those who receive care often go on to care for others, and thus the signal spreads. It's a domino effect that aligns with the idea that messages are not only personal but have social reach. This is a crucial point. Awakening is not solitary. It is always relational. The journey is made in a network. It's also common for the wake-up call to bring a new sensitivity to signs in nature and circumstances. People begin to read environmental changes, social dislocations, and economic crises more closely as calls to responsibility, not just as catastrophes that happen by chance. This interpretation doesn't transform scientific events into mysticism. It transforms the way we respond to them. Less panic, more responsibility, less guilt, and more compassionate action. The mindset shifts from a reptile of fear to an agent of care. This is where the message finds practical application. Action and prayer combine in decisions that have concrete consequences. The presence of personal accounts also makes up the signal's mosaic. Many describe a moment of clarity, a phrase read at just the right time, a dream that points to a decision, a sense of urgency that led to reconciliation with a loved one. These intimate revelations, even if they seem small, play a strategic role in the map. They function as internal landmarks that guide behaviors and attitudes. When multiple accounts from different people and places begin to point to similar experiences, more prayer, more reconciliation, more abandonment of harmful habits, it's reasonable to recognize a pattern that deserves attention and study. Discerning this sign requires a balance between sensitivity and judgment. It doesn't mean accepting every report unfiltered, nor cultivating a skepticism that closes the heart. Discerning means evaluating the results, observing repercussions, and checking consistency between testimonies and actions. It's an attitude of humility, listening without haste, but also acting when the results are tangible. The change in mindset required here isn't passive. It's an active willingness to reevaluate choices, to implement decisions that strengthen communities, and to prioritize what endures in trials. Love, faith, mercy. In practical terms, how can we recognize and respond to the wake-up call? First, observe changes in collective behavior. More prayer meetings, more volunteering, more requests for reconciliation. Second, notice personal changes. A decision to stop a destructive habit, a word of forgiveness, an offer of service. Third, listen for dream reports, inner signs, or unexpected invitations to conversion that recur in different contexts. These clues, taken together, draw a functional map. The response suggested by the messages is always proportional. Humility, prayer, concrete actions of love, and organizing one's life around what truly matters. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and show concrete examples of how this sign has already appeared in real lives, how small choices have become foundations of resistance, and how, step by step, the communities that embraced this awakening have built paths of hope amidst hardship. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and delve into the realm of trials and purification, which is perhaps the most difficult and, at the same time, the most revealing part of this secret map. When the messages speak of trials, they are not merely describing external events. They are pointing to an intimate process that reshapes character, priorities, and relationships. Purification, in this sense, appears as a refining fire. It removes what is superfluous, reveals what is essential, and makes visible what truly sustains life. Visually, imagine losing something you considered indispensable: a job that gave you status, a social bond that fueled vanity, or even the security of a project that seemed unshakable, and, in its empty place, experiencing a call to trust in something greater. These losses are painful. They are shocks that force quick decisions, shifts, and profound reevaluations. The impact of these ruptures is not just material, it is decisive, moral, and spiritual. The question that echoes in the messages and that I invite you to ask now is direct and cutting. What would you be willing to let go of for faith? Losing isn't synonymous with defeat when loss leads to transformation. There are stories that seem simple on the surface, but that, deep within the experience, contain radical shifts in mindset. A family that loses income and finds a way to survive through sharing, an individual whose life plan collapses and rediscovers purpose in service. A community that, faced with a natural disaster, replaces despair with attitudes of mutual care. These are harsh scenarios, with powerful visual images: damaged homes, empty tables, tears on long night sand. Among these images, small scenes of mercy, outstretched hands, shared bread, whispered prayers among neighbors. These elements compose the language of trials, not to shatter hope, but to purify it, to test what remains when everything else is gone. At a collective level, trials act as catalysts for social reaction. Economic crises, climate disasters, political tensions — all of these can act as a firestorm that exposes weaknesses. But there's an underlying logic to the persistent messages. The true measure of response isn't panic, but the quality of decisions made under pressure. Small decisions, like prioritizing those in need, rearranging schedules to care for the elderly, and creating support groups, have a multiplier effect. This is a practical, tangible transformation that changes the map. Previously ignored routes become paths of life. From the perspective of the human journey, purification requires renunciation and courage. Renunciation isn't about losing identity, it's about cutting out what impedes growth. Courage, in turn, is choosing compassion when the tendency might be self-preservation. There is also an emotional aspect that deserves to be highlighted. Purification involves encountering one's own vulnerability. In many accounts, the trial triggers a process of difficult self-discovery, a look at old wounds that need to be healed. Someone who, faced with loss, realizes they were numb to superficial activities and decides to seek meaning. Another person who, when facing illness or grief, rediscovers the importance of reconciliation. These internal revelations are perhaps the most valuable fruit of trials, not because we desire suffering, but because we recognize that, without the shock, many structures would remain intact and possibly dead inside. Purification, then, acts like a surgeon removing necrotic tissue so that new life can emerge. In practical terms, the messages suggest practices that function as instruments of purification. Fasting, persevering prayer, intentional silence, confession, and service to the poor appear repeatedly as paths to meaningfully navigate trials. These practices are not magic solutions. They function as discipline that shapes the mind and heart, preparing the person for decisions that require detachment. Transformation and discipline go hand in hand. Without conscious decision, trials tend to produce anxiety. With discipline, they produce conversion. And true change is not just personal, it reverberates throughout the community, creating a culture of resilience and solidarity. The images that often accompany these accounts are powerful. Families praying amidst the rubble, neighbors carrying roof tiles, volunteers arriving with supplies, hands holding hands in the dark night. These are powerful images, but what the messages highlight is the intentionality behind them. This isn't spontaneous, isolated heroism, but a practice cultivated over time: habits of prayer, support networks, a mindset that prioritizes others. This is the foundation of the transformations we see. It's not just a reaction to an event. It's the result of a prior journey of spiritual and moral preparation. We must also recognize the danger of the narrative that glamorizes suffering. Purification is not romanticizing pain. It is understanding a real, painful, and necessary process that requires accompaniment, support, and wisdom. The hidden truth here is twofold. On the one hand, there is a call for courage and surrender. On the other, there is the need for practical care and discernment to avoid succumbing to despair. Communities that handled trials with balance, offering psychological support, practical organization, and listening spaces avoided dangerous deviations and transformed the crisis into an opportunity for human growth. This balance between spirit and pragmatism is a central lesson of the messages. When we think about decisions, it's important to remember that they don't have to be grand to be decisive. A small decision made in times of need, forgiving someone who wronged us, prioritizing sharing over hoarding, accepting help when pride wants to isolate us, can define the course of a life and the shape of a community. The journey of purification, therefore, is made up of a succession of courageous decisions. The secret map doesn't promise painless paths, but it offers routes where pain transforms into redemption when accompanied by purpose and solidarity. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, exploring real stories of people who have experienced loss, faced trials, and found, through purification, a new way of living. Understanding how these experiences serve as practical lessons and how they inspire paths of change, both individual and communal. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and talk about family as a living refuge, this nucleus that the messages point to as central to navigating trials with meaning and dignity. When family becomes a refuge, it's not just a cluster of biological ties. It's a space for mental formation, for practicing ethical decisions, and for daily transformation. Think of the simplest scene, a table with people exchanging silence and words, a shared dish, hands touching at the end of a common prayer. These seemingly small images are, in fact, anchor points on the secret map markers that, cumulatively, generate real impact. The proposal here is not to idealize perfect homes, but to transform routine into a framework for practices that consolidate emotional and spiritual resilience. In many accounts from communities impacted by the messages, rebuilding family life was the first step that triggered greater changes. When one decides to restore family dinners, reduce screen time, and set aside time for intimate dialogue, space opens up for values like forgiveness, sharing, and responsibility to flourish. Transformation begins with daily decisions, deciding to listen instead of reacting, choosing to forgive instead of accumulating resentment, opting for a moment of silence instead of filling everything with noise. These decisions, however modest, reshape the collective mentality of the home. For example, establishing a fixed time for family prayer, 5, 10, 15 minutes, creates a rhythm that shifts priorities. A small ritual like lighting a candle before a meal, reading a passage that inspires humility, and giving thanks out loud can, over time, transform each member's perception of themselves and the world. It's not about religious performance, but about training the heart for coherence between belief and practice. The hidden truth that many testimonies reveal is not an inaccessible mystical secret, but the realization that sustained spiritual habits yield tangible fruits, less impulsiveness, greater empathy, and a concrete practice of mutual support when the evidence arises. There are also practical practices, simple measures that any family can adopt today. Set aside time to talk without technological interruptions. Create a discreet and sacred space at home for prayer or reflection. Establish a weekly sharing night where everyone shares a difficulty and a gratitude. Teach children to pray simply and value caring for others. Logistically, this may involve objective decisions, reducing outside work hours when possible, reorganizing finances to prioritize essential needs, identifying neighbors and relatives who can form a support network. These decisions express a mindset that prefers community building to isolation. The practical dimension does not nullify the spiritual. On the contrary, it complements it. Moderate fasting, prayer discipline, and acts of charity become instruments of purification and preparation, helping each member face shocks with greater serenity. The behind the scenes of this change is made up of small sacrifices and repeated gestures, giving up an outing to be at home with those in need, stopping a fight to ask for forgiveness, sharing resources without expecting recognition. It is in this silent work that refuge is consolidated. Families who organize to welcome the elderly, who teach children to share, who create routines of spiritual reading and prayer, end up forming a kind of emotional infrastructure capable of cushioning the impact of external crises. The impact is not immediate, but cumulative. A culture of care created today will be the difference tomorrow, when trials arrive. And when I say tomorrow, I mean both extraordinary events and intimate crises, unemployment, illness, loss, situations in which the family network can mean the difference between disintegration and recovery. The revelations that emerge from the accounts of those who have experienced this change are often moving. People recount how a conversation at the table, a sincere apology, or the resumption of a simple tradition, a goodnight prayer, a gesture of sharing were responsible for averting greater divisions and reorienting crucial decisions. There are also stories of families who, after adopting a discipline of prayer and service, mobilized to help neighbors and, in doing so, found renewed meaning and purpose. These testimonies show that the refuge family is not self-isolation or sectarianism. It is a base of operations for a greater witness, a unity that breathes faith and compassion beyond the walls of the home. It's important to emphasize that strengthening the family doesn't mean omitting conflicts or stifling differences. It means learning to live within limits and transforming friction into opportunities for growth. Practical tools such as active listening, conflict mediation, and regular moments of reconciliation can be taught and practiced. Creating a silence box for conflict situations, adopting nonviolent communication techniques, and seeking outside help when necessary counseling. Spiritual direction. Support groups are smart and mature decisions that prevent crises from becoming irreparable ruptures. In many stories, seeking help was a decisive step that ultimately proved to be a sign of wisdom and courage, not weakness. The journey of making the family a refuge also requires rethinking social and cultural priorities, reducing exposure to content that fuels anxiety, choosing friendships that build, limiting the race for status that erodes time and affection. These are mindset choices that imply economic and relational decisions. When the family collectively decides that relational well-being is worth more than appearances, a profound transformation begins that reverberates in how each member faces challenges. It is a process of disengagement, of letting go of old narratives, and of embracing new practices of solidarity. Finally, it's worth mentioning that family refuge is not a panacea. It works best when it opens up to the community, when it builds bridges, not walls. Interfamily networks, local prayer groups, mutual aid initiatives, pastoral care, and solidarity movements broaden the refuge's reach and make it more resilient. The idea is that the family is a living cell within a larger network. The more inherent the practice of care, the deeper the revelations about what truly matters. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Explore concrete examples of practices that families have adopted, simple rituals, routine adjustments, courageous decisions, and see how these acts have become paths of spiritual and community survival. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject and speak about the signs in the sky and on earth with a tone that combines authority and prudence. Because interpreting extraordinary phenomena requires both sensitivity and method. When we mention signs in the sky and on earth, we're not just evoking cinematic images of lights or rare events. We're also talking about recurring weather patterns, intensifying social changes, economic disruptions, and cultural movements that, when read together, can reveal valuable clues about the direction of our journey. In the social sphere, signs in the earth appear as cultural shifts, the weakening of community ties, urban isolation, the weakening of solidarity practices. The messages, in this regard, invite us to re-establish microstructures of care strength, homes, parishes, and local associations, because it is these networks that cushion the impact of crises. The mindset proposed by the secret map is preventive and relational, prioritizing time for real connections, investing in coexistence, promoting decisions that prioritize the common good over isolation. At the same time, cultural signs require interpretative prudence. Not every crisis is a prophetic sign. Many are the consequence of economic or political dynamics predictable by experts. Discernment involves cross-referencing information, listening to scientists, monitoring meteorological data, and, at the same time, paying attention to the spiritual fruits emerging in communities. A balanced reading combines reason and faith, analysis and intuition, and rejects both alarmism and skeptical closure. Hidden truth, when it exists, usually manifests itself not in spectacles, but in consistent fruit. Families that regroup, groups that organize aid, habits that shift toward service to others. On a personal level, interpreting signs requires cultivating silence, a routine of attention, and formative practices. Regular prayer, reflective reading, dialogue with trusted people, and with spiritual leaders who possess humility and prudence. Internal revelations, dreams, intuitions, sudden invitations to action, only gain substance when crossed with external evidence and when they lead to fruits of love and service. The transformation suggested by the messages involves everyday decisions, forgiving, reconciling, prioritizing time with those in need, responsibly reorganizing finances, and teaching children practices of solidarity. The behind-the-scenes nature of discernment also includes an essential question about motivation. Do we seek signs to guide us in conversion and service, or to fuel fears? The mindset with which we approach the stories determines their impact. Approaching signs with humility and method allows us to distinguish between stories that care for the soul and narratives that exploit anxiety. Practical verification tools help. comparing testimonies, observing the consistency of results, consulting technical sources, and monitoring whether reactions generate more cohesion or more discord. To illustrate what this means in practice, consider communities that, faced with repeated floods, did not limit themselves to immediate reaction, but created prevention routines, support networks, and projects to convert degraded areas into urban gardens that feed families. The combination of rational analysis, organized decisions, and spiritual commitment transformed risk into an opportunity for reconstruction with profound social impact. This kind of response is what the messages seem to encourage, not by escapism, but a concrete stance that blends discernment, planning, and compassion. It's also necessary to warn against readings that foster panic or promise easy answers. Purifying messages shouldn't be confused with glamorizing suffering. Rather, it proposes discipline, training, and actions that sustain life. The journey of discernment includes ethical formation, psychological support, and practical structure because transforming suffering into learning requires support, not just lofty ideals. Communities that have combined spirituality with practical planning have shown concrete results: less social fragmentation, greater responsiveness, and a type of resilience that goes beyond improvisation. In terms of method, some practices help maintain a balance between sensitivity and criticism. Documenting occurrences to identify patterns, cross-referencing reports with technical data, practicing interprofessional dialogue, and creating community. Listening spaces where decisions are made collectively and responsibly. Leadership training focused on empathy and logistics. Local psychological support programs and small solidarity economy projects are examples of measures that transform intentions into viable actions. Furthermore, there is an essential educational aspect, teaching families and schools a mindset of care, responsibility, and practical preparation, without alarmism but with compassionate realism. When reading the signs with this balance, revelations even the most subtle take on practical meaning and become action paths that protect lives and dignity. Finally, it's worth remembering that discernment isn't about closing oneself off to mystery or abandoning it to cold reason. It's about maintaining a vigilant, humble, and responsible attitude, capable of integrating inner revelations with external evidence and transforming insights into measures that have a real impact on people's lives. To operationalize this discernment, adopt concrete practices. Keep an observation journal to cross-reference dreams, events, and reactions. Consult experts, meteorologists, sociologists, trained leaders to validate hypotheses. Promote local meetings to plan practical responses. Add routes, meeting points, simple community stockpiles. Train leadership with a focus on empathy and logistics. Invest in psychological support and training programs that combine spirituality and organization, and prioritize measures that strengthen emotional bonds. Educate children on resilience and small solidarity economy projects by combining method, conscious decisions, and spiritual practices. The map ceases to be theory and becomes a roadmap for action with real impact. A set of paths a community can follow to protect what is essential. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and talk about personal conversion as something urgent, practical, and profoundly transformative. Not a nice idea to mention on retreats, but a concrete shift in mindset that alters decisions, relationships, and the way one interacts with the world. The conversion the messages point to is not primarily a spectacular event. It's a series of choices that erode old habits and plant new patterns of life. Think of it as a small inner revolution that gradually begins to have external repercussions. The journey of those who convert usually begins with a vague restlessness, a persistent feeling that something needs to change, and from this arise attitudes that, combined, produce a real impact: less impulsiveness, more attention to others, prioritizing what nourishes the soul. True transformation is, ultimately, a change of orientation. What previously guided life: ambition, vanity, consumption gives way to priorities like dedication, service, and coherence. To bring this to life, I want to tell a story that resonates with many accounts I've heard behind the scenes. There was a woman, let's call her Maria, who spent her days divided between exhausting shifts and nights empty of family conversation. Life was a sequence of tasks and distractions. Faith, when it existed, was hidden in sporadic practices that barely touched the heart. Soon, small losses began to arrive: an unexpected layoff, a relative's prolonged illness, the feeling that routine had consumed all meaning. One sleepless night, leafing through an old notebook, she found a forgotten note, a simple phrase: "Forgive me." Today, it remained like a spark. Her next choice was not grand. She called the daughter she had broken up with years before and simply said, "Can I talk?" The conversation was tense, full of hurt, but it ended with an apology and a hug that lasted minutes, as if condensing years of absence. This small decision, made in the heat of vulnerability, triggered a series of movements. Maria agreed to seek spiritual counsel, began waking up 15 minutes earlier to pray, and gradually established a habit of weekly meetings with her family. The loss that had wounded her job, her pride, her security became an opportunity to reshape her priorities. A mindset of self-preservation gave way to a mindset of service. Decisions, once reactive, became intentional. This anecdote isn't a corny plea, it's an illustrative example of the kind of revelation these messages bring. Conversion often manifests itself in concrete cuts and commitments. The question that resonates and is decisive is straightforward. What would you be willing to let go of for faith? Letting go can mean leaving a corrosive routine, reducing habits that scatter the heart, prioritizing reconciliation over maintaining the justification of resentment. These decisions are costly, require courage, and often social and spiritual support. Therefore, the community dimension is essential. Isolated conversions without support tend to be fragile. Conversions anchored in faith communities and regular practices of discipline, prayer, reading, moderate fasting, confession, more likely to persevere and generate lasting impact. There are also revelations about the progressive nature of this transformation. It's not common for someone to change overnight in all spheres of life. Conversion is a series of everyday actions that, when accumulated, alter one's inner geography. Someone who begins to prioritize an ethical decision in small gestures, returning something found, telling the truth when lying would be easier, dedicating time to an elderly neighbor reveals that their mindset is being reshaped. These signs are both fruit and confirmation. The choice confirms the inner change and, at the same time, nourishes it. Transformation creates a virtuous cycle, and this cycle spreads. The transformed person influences family, friends, and the neighborhood. The impact is multiplied. From a practical standpoint, the messages suggest concrete steps for those who feel this call to conversion. First, cultivate simplicity. Reduce distractions that steal time and attention, creating space for what matters. Second, adopt regular practices that nourish the spirit. Reading, prayer, silence, participation in groups that foster mutual accountability. Third, make ethical decisions in small acts, which ultimately reorient larger priorities. Fourth, let go of pride and seek reconciliation, recognition, and, if necessary, outside help, counseling, spiritual direction, therapy. These measures don't promise a life without pain, but they offer a framework through which pain is integrated as an element of growth, not just destruction. There is also a hidden truth worth mentioning. Genuine conversion often involves social risk. Changing one's mindset can put someone at odds with professional, family, or cultural expectations. There may be resistance and loss. Mary, in the story I told, faced incomprehension from acquaintances who didn't understand why she had changed her routines and priorities. But at the same time, the same conversion opened new doors, support networks, deep friendships, and a renewed sense of purpose. Decisions that seem costly in the short term bear lasting fruit when aligned with principles of compassion and service. This is the paradoxical logic of the spiritual journey, losing something to gain another kind of life. The urgency emphasized by the messages isn't panic, it's clarity. Certain opportunities for transformation appear as thresholds, moments when a decision opens a path and indecision closes it. Therefore, the call is practical. Be attentive, make small, coherent choices. Seek the company of those who help you stay on track. Personal conversion is, therefore, both an internal process and a community project. It reconfigures how we perceive priorities, reorganizes the decision-making agenda, and impacts the surrounding social fabric. When many experience this networked conversion, entire communities become more resilient, compassionate, and prepared to face trials with dignity. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, exploring collective examples of conversion that have reshaped neighborhoods, parishes, and social movements, and analyzing how these changes influence local policies, the solidarity economy, and educational practices, seeing how a series of individual decisions becomes a map of real transformation. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and talk about practical spiritual preparation as a core support for those who wish to transform fear into virtuous action. The preparation proposed in the messages is not a magic formula or a set of empty rituals. It is a discipline that shapes mindset and affects everyday decisions. First, prayer, not as a ritualistic observance, but as a daily practice of listening and surrender. Praying regularly creates a rhythm that recalibrates the heart, makes the mind less hostage to anxiety, and helps us perceive more clearly the small revelations of everyday life. Community prayer, with family or close groups, enhances this effect because it creates mutual accountability and visible signs of commitment to inner transformation. Second, fasting understood as a discipline of freedom. Fasting is not just about depriving oneself of food, it is a gesture that reduces the voracity of consumption, educates the will, and opens space for inner listening. Moderate fasting helps restore a sober mindset, less dependence on stimuli, more clarity in decisions, and greater sensitivity to others who are suffering. In community practices, fasting can be accompanied by acts of sharing, transforming austerity into concrete solidarity. In this sense, fasting produces a dual effect. It tunes the body and soul and encourages practical decisions of charity and reorganization of priorities. Reconciliation ranks third among essential practices. Reconciliation involves untying emotional knots that impede the flow of love and trust, apologizing, offering forgiveness, and seeking reparation when possible. These are decisions that free relational energy and create space for support networks. Reconciliation is not a one-off act. It is a habit of humility that transforms tense environments into places of healing. When families and communities invest in reparation and dialogue, resilience in the face of crises visibly increases, because less time and resources are consumed by internal conflicts, and more energy is available to respond to what truly matters. Charity, finally, is the practice that translates all others into concrete action. Charity is not sporadic alms giving. It is a permanent commitment to the well-being of others. Donating time, resources, and attention creates measurable impacts on the lives of vulnerable people and produces a multiplier effect. Those who receive often become agents of care. Charity educates people about real needs, helps combat cultural narcissism, and forms a self-replicating service mentality. Communities that institutionalize small practices of sharing build, over time, a support infrastructure that better withstands trials. It's important to emphasize why inner preparedness trumps material accumulation. Stockpiling resources may offer temporary security, but it doesn't guarantee emotional, moral, or relational resilience. In prolonged crises, what saves us is community cohesion, clarity of ethical decisions, and the ability to maintain hope. A family well provided for materially but emotionally disjointed tends to succumb more quickly to disintegration. On the other hand, a community with solid spiritual practices and support networks has a real impact on preserving human dignity. Inner preparedness shapes attitudes that allow us to share, reorganize, and create creative solutions when the unexpected happens. Furthermore, spiritual practices act as mental filters that guide decisions under pressure. When panic sets in, those who practice silence and prayer tend to have greater emotional control, think more clearly, and make decisions proportionate to real needs. Fasting and reconciliation help curb egoic impulses that distort choices. Charity creates a focus on others rather than self-preservation. Together, these practices form a mindset of prudence and compassion that reduces the likelihood of impulsive decisions and reinforces the positive impact of collective choices. The behind-the-scenes look at these practices reveals that they require discipline and community. It's difficult to maintain a prayer routine alone. Fasting is a more sustainable exercise when done in a group. Reconciliation requires safe environments to occur. Charity bears greater fruit when organized. Therefore, practical preparation includes organizational decisions, creating prayer circles, planning fasts integrated with sharing activities, forming listening groups, and creating small local councils to coordinate aid. These structural decisions are as important as the rituals themselves, because they transform intention into logistics. An often overlooked point is the role of education and training. Spiritual preparation isn't just about practicing rituals, it's about developing management skills. First aid, basic logistics, and financial literacy for vulnerable families. The combination of practical and spiritual training creates human capital that multiplies the impact of practices. Leaders inspire and organize responses, and educated communities respond with creativity and efficiency. The transformation we seek is, therefore, holistic, mind, heart, and hands working together. Finally, it's worth remembering that spiritual preparation has a prophylactic character. The more established our internal practices are, the less susceptible we are to anxious narratives that exploit fear. Hidden truth, when sought honestly, appears less like a conspiracy theory and more like an ethical compass that guides decisions. Preparing the heart is preparing the community. Preparing the mind is preparing action. This is why the messages emphasize prayer, fasting, reconciliation, and charity, not to replace technical prudence, but to ensure that technical decisions are made by people with character, solidarity, and clarity. As a practical example, establish a daily time of 10 minutes of silence and prayer. Combine a monthly day of community fasting with a food drive. Create a weekly cycle of reconciliation where each member shares a small failure and a lesson learned. And implement a group of neighbors who take turns supporting the elderly. These small but decisive decisions have an immediate impact and build the discipline needed to face larger crises with wisdom and compassion. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic. and share real stories of communities that combined these practices and thus transformed weaknesses into tangible safety nets, highlighting how personal transformation translates into social impact. Comment below. This resonates with me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and land on the point that gives meaning to all the cartography we've seen so far, the hope and ultimate promise that permeate the messages. This isn't a frivolous optimism or cliches. It's an embodied hope, a promise that impacts people's real lives and transforms fear into courage, despair into resolve, inertia into movement. The messages circulating around Medjugorje don't just warn, they always point to a way out, a promise of renewal that accompanies the ordeal like a shadow accompanies the body, inseparable and paradoxically guiding. This contrast between fear and consolation is essential to understanding the dynamics of the secret map. The warning sharpens sensitivity, the danger reveals priorities, and the ultimate promise gives human choices, a horizon of meaning that legitimizes effort and renunciation. Imagine the scene. After the storm, when mud still sticks to shoes and the walls need repair, a gesture appears that restores dignities, bringing a hot pot, a child receiving a blanket, a neighbor accepting an outstretched hand and beginning to rebuild with others. That promise of salvation is not an abstract slogan. It is the thread that connects these gestures and gives them the courage to continue. In terms of transformation, the promise functions as a goal that guides decisions. When I know there is the possibility of renewal, I act with less panic and more purpose. The mindset shifts. It ceases to be an obsession with immediate security and becomes an investment in ordinary life, in relationships, and in practices that survive shocks. This redirection of priorities is the most lasting impact that revelations can have. In the narratives of those who have experienced conversion and purification, there is a recurring theme. After the ordeal, many report a sense of unprecedented clarity, as if something had been removed from their inner vision. This clarity is also a promise. It suggests a possible future where the loss is not total, where what was destroyed can be transformed into the foundation for something new. This is the revealing part of the messages. They present a hidden truth that challenges fatalism. Instead of accepting ruin as an end, people begin to see it as an opportunity to recreate, reorder, and rediscover meaning. This attitude generates different decisions: investing in education, organizing local support networks, rebuilding community spaces, and, in doing so, produces a real impact on collective life. Hope, when genuine, is also practical. It's not passively waiting for a miracle, it's preparing to be a co-author of the promise. This means cultivating habits that, though discreet, create possibilities for restoration. Investing in relationships, teaching future generations to care for the earth and each other, prioritizing solidarity over competition for scarce resources. The ultimate promise, therefore, is realized through concrete and repeated decisions: planting where there was once devastation, welcoming those who were excluded, transforming fear into service. There's a multiplier effect. One family that decides to reopen their home to welcome those who lost their footing inspires another. And in a short time, a network is formed that makes reconstruction faster and more dignified. On an emotional level, the promise offers a consolation that isn't anesthetic. True consolation doesn't erase pain. It challenges it, penetrates it, and transforms it. Many stories I've heard behind the scenes tell of people who, after a profound crisis, found a different kind of joy, a joy built on gratitude, restored friendship, and a new sense of mission. This joy isn't naivete, but the fruit of a continuous decision to see the good that's possible and act to grow it. The ultimate revelation of the messages, therefore, is twofold. There's a warning about real risks, and there's the promise that if we nurture practices of love and responsibility, there will be renewal. It's a moral reasoning that ethics and hope, other-centered attitudes, bear fruit that confirm the veracity of the promise. There's also a pedagogical effect to this promise. It teaches the community how to transform memories of pain into a foundation for learning. Instead of repeating destructive patterns, people begin to record lessons: how to manage resources, how to care for the elderly, how to organize food and medicine, how to create moments of listening that prevent ruptures. These lessons emerge behind the scenes as small, informal institutions, sharing circles, community gardens, emotional support groups which, when cultivated, become living testaments to the promise fulfilled. The practical impact is clear. More organized communities, with a caring mindset, better withstand future shocks and, therefore, realize the promised hope. At the same time, it is necessary to maintain mature discernment. The promise does not justify passivity or abdication of responsibility. Hope and action go hand in hand. The promise acts as a beacon, but it demands that decisions be made consciously. The transformation it proposes involves sacrifice and investment, and sometimes requires negotiating losses to achieve greater gains in dignity and communion. The hidden truth revealed in the messages is not a magical shortcut. It is an invitation to a journey of formation, discipline, and solidarity, where every gesture counts and every choice shapes the collective future. Culturally, the promise also serves as an antidote to the discouragement that paralyzes. In times marked by fast-paced news and sensationalism, having a perspective of renewal helps keep one engaged in meaningful actions. When the mindset shifts from surviving at all costs to building a dignified life, decisions change. Education, community health, the solidarity, economy, and care practices that sustain generations are prioritized. This shift in focus produces a systemic impact. Hope, combined with concrete practices, reorganizes social networks and strengthens community resilience. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and show, with vivid examples, how the ultimate promise manifested itself in communities that faced collapse and, through courageous decisions and spiritual discipline, reshaped their destiny into something more humane and sustainable. Comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and talk about how to read this secret map today in light of contemporary signs without falling into either facile sensationalism or sterile skepticism. We live in a time when politics, climate, and moral crisis intertwine in complex ways. It's natural for hasty interpretations to emerge. But the mature reading I propose begins with the observation of patterns and the search for concrete results. When I speak of current signs and clues, I don't want you to think only of spectacles in the sky. I'm thinking of trends that change life structures, political polarization that erodes trust, climate change that displaces populations, the precariousness of work that redefines the sense of security. These phenomena are part of the backdrop that demand decisions and cause impact on the messages. In this context, serve as an invitation to transform reaction into an intelligent response. Discerning requires, above all, a calm investigative mindset, gathering data, listening to experts when appropriate, and above all, observing whether reactions to these signs generate more social coherence or more disorder. A hidden truth worth highlighting is this: signals that promote reconciliation, mutual care, and practices of solidarity tend to be signs of something healthy. Signals that fuel fear and isolation often mirror interests that exploit anxiety. To read this map today, start by mapping what's local and what's global. Not every global crisis will be visible on your street, but global patterns, prolonged drought, economic shifts, migration flows resonate in communities and can generate opportunities for local action. Take a realistic look. What climate changes are affecting your surroundings? Where is unemployment rising or public services disrupted? These clues help prioritize practical decisions, from organizing community gardens to creating support groups for vulnerable people. At the same time, evaluate moral signals. Is there an increase in practices that erode human dignity where you live? Are there discourses that normalize violence or eliminate dialogue? The transformation the messages propose is not escapism. It asks us to translate concern into ethical decisions, education, support, presence that strengthens social bonds. This is the practical path that aligns faith and action without panic. A practical mini-script for discernment can help set all this in motion. First, record events and reactions. A simple community diary recording weather events, local political campaigns, escalating conflicts, or solidarity initiatives reveals patterns over time. Second, compare accounts. Personal testimonies gain strength when they appear repeatedly in different contexts. This is where a pattern emerges, not just noise. Third, consult technical sources, meteorologists, local economists, community leaders with practical experience. Crossing technical information with spiritual sensitivity avoids biased interpretations. Fourth, observe the fruits of reactions. Actions that generate cohesion, mutual aid, and strengthening networks are indications that the signal deserves attention. Reactions that sow fear, division, or exploitation deserve caution. These 4 steps: recording, comparing, consulting, and evaluating fruits form a mini-script that allows for methodical, safe, and alarm-free discernment. Furthermore, invest in small but strategic decisions that increase resilience without dramatic rush. Organize local meeting points, implement a communication system between neighbors, identify people with useful skills, health, logistics, mechanics, and create a small bank of rotating essential goods. Decisions of this kind demonstrate immediate impact. They reduce vulnerability, strengthen bonds, and generate practical confidence. At the same time, promote training, meetings on first aid, home economics, food management, and psychological support. The preparation journey is both one of empowerment and inner transformation. Training and spirituality complement each other to create communities that think and act wisely. In terms of mindset, the key shift is learning to separate urgency from panic. Urgency demands decision, panic paralyzes. Changing the language we use in public conversations helps. Exchanging narratives that instill fear for narratives that encourage responsibility and care. This is a cultural decision that is reflected in local policies and family practices. Another essential dimension is epistemological humility, accepting that we don't know everything, but that we can act based on our best in terms of science, ethics, and compassion. This stance avoids two dangerous traps: dogmatic closure that rejects evidence, and relativism that ignores fundamental moral truths. Behind the scenes of this careful reading of the map, practical revelations emerge when communities act in an integrated manner. Vegetable gardens emerge that reduce dependence on external food, solidarity, economy networks that cushion shocks, and listening spaces that prevent emotional rupture. These are marks of tangible impact, signs that inner preparation and practical decisions have produced real results. And it is precisely this marriage of interiority, prayer, fasting, reconciliation, and external organization logistics, training, networks that lends credibility to the map we are drawing. The hidden truth is not a set of mystical secrets, but the realization that small coherent choices have the cumulative power to transform vulnerability into dignity. There is also an ethical component that demands attention. Discerning signs, without sensationalism, is an exercise in responsibility toward others. Spreading panic or unfounded theories exacerbates the problem. Sharing verified information, encouraging solidarity, and promoting informed dialogue are decisions that protect. Thus, the practice of discernment is also in practice of charity. By clarifying, we organize. By organizing, we serve. By serving, we expand hope. This cycle produces an impact that goes beyond the immediate tight shapes a culture of care capable of resistance and regeneration. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, exploring how to apply this mini-route to real-world scenarios, involving local politics, climate events, and social disruptions. Examining cases where prudent judgment averted major crises, and where the lack thereof caused widespread damage. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and close this section with an image that lingers long after the video fades out. Imagine a narrow dirt road, houses lined with small backyards, and in the center, a family gathered around a makeshift stove after the storm. Candlelight isn't just a dramatic device, it's a sign of fragility and, at the same time, of tenderness. A grandmother holds her grandson's hand, her face marked by worry and hope at the same time. The grandson, who yesterday cried with fear, now translates the unease everyone feels into simple questions: will everything be okay? The answer doesn't come from theories, it comes from a gesture. The father raises his voice to pray, speaks a few words calmly, and asks each person to share one small thing they're grateful for. There's silence, there are tears, and there's also a decision that pulses stronger than fear to reorganize life around what matters. This scene summarizes the logic underlying the messages: a warning that awakens, a trial that purifies, a family that becomes a refuge, and a hope that reorients decisions. It's not an idealized tale, it's a behind-the-scenes snapshot that echoes many real-life stories. In losing comfort, the essential is revealed, and this essential, when rediscovered, has a transformative power that doesn't fit in headlines, but changes human trajectories. The testimony I want to share now comes precisely from this behind-the-scenes experience, not to impress, but to show the concrete impact of the promise when it finds practice and courage in small, everyday decisions. I met a community that, after a severe flood, could have retreated into despair and rivalry over scarce resources. Instead, they decided to shelter one another, share supplies, and create a small network of service exchanges. One repaired roofs, another offered classes for children, a neighbor cared for the elderly. The initial gesture was humble, sharing what they had. But the aftermath was a profound transformation of the local mentality. Instead of each family trying to survive in isolation, regular practices of listening, simple community prayer, and a rudimentary logistics of mutual aid were established, which, over time, became a real mechanism for recovery. The hidden truth these experiences reveal is that the promise of renewal works especially well when small choices are repeated with discipline. When the community decides to prioritize dignity over despair, the impact was not just material, it was ethical and emotional. Relationships were rebuilt, trust was restored, and a feeling that life, even if wounded, could be reordered with meaning. There is still something essential about the tone of these messages that needs to be made honestly clear. The secret map, despite its mention of tribulation and trials, is not meant to paralyze. The warning exists to guide. When a mother decides, for example, to teach her children to pray before bed or to tend a small community garden, she is responding to a pedagogical call. She trains the next generation in a mindset of care, solidarity, and responsible decision. The transformation that results from these practices is subtle and cumulative, and therefore powerful. It shapes character, shifts priorities, and a culture that values the common good. This process is part of the journey, It reveals intimate, behind the scenes where the true work of reconstruction takes place. Away from the spotlight, in the space of repeated attitudes. The revelations that emerge from these processes are not always spectacular. Often they are simple insights capable of altering the course of a life. Forgive first, share what you have, listen to those who cry beside you. These short sentences carry decisions that, once made, change mindsets and generate lasting impact. The tension between fear and consolation also permeates public and political decisions. In situations where the crisis worsens, droughts, displacements, economic disruptions, the promise encourages acts of solidarity-based leadership. Managers who prioritize supplies for the most vulnerable, solidarity economy initiatives that create local jobs, educational programs that teach concrete skills beyond theory. The impact of these options is practical and immediate. They reduce suffering, maintain dignity, and strengthen the social network. And, at the same time, they demonstrate that hope is not an abstract ideal, but a set of decisions with measurable effects. When communities adopt this mindset, the journey ceases to be simply about surviving and becomes about rebuilding with purpose. The transformation appears in the details. Children who play happily again, the elderly who receive regular care, neighbors who exchange services without bureaucracy. These are small, silent revolutions that, together, constitute a true renewal. In terms of hidden truth, there is an ethical lesson that needs to be addressed. There is no contradiction between preparing and keeping an open heart. Practical preparedness, organized supplies, backup plans. First aid training does not replace charity. On the contrary, it should be fueled by it. The mindset the map proposes is integrative. It unites technical prudence with spiritual generosity. This means making responsible decisions, yes, but without losing sight of the hope that encourages sharing, welcoming, and restoring. The impact of this balance can be seen in community initiatives that, in addition to offering immediate help, invest in continuing education, food cultivation, and psychological support structures. These medium-term decisions are investments in resilience that prove the promise the messages proclaim. By painting this scene of urgency and tenderness, we don't want to romanticize pain or minimize real suffering. On the contrary, recognizing the harshness of trials is a condition for compassion and wise action. Mary's message, in this painting, acts as a call that balances alertness and consolation, an invitation to transform uneasiness into resolve and fragility into care. This is the essence of the map, to offer references that help guide human steps, always with discernment and love. When someone goes through a trial and encounters a concrete gesture of care in another, we see that the promise of renewal has both feet and hands. It manifests itself in acts that restore dignity and rebuild hope. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and bring examples even closer to everyday life stories that show how specific actions brought about decisive changes in families and neighborhoods, and how these experiences become practical lessons for anyone willing to act with courage and heart. Comment below. This resonates with me. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for walking with me through these reflections. It already says a lot about your heart and your quest. If this content brought clarity, comfort, or sparked a welcome restlessness, subscribe to the channel. I will continue to bring you analyses, testimonies, and practical guidance that help transform restlessness into meaningful decisions. If you want to mark that you were with me until the end, leave the phrase "I'm with you until the end" in the comments. I will read and respond personally when I can, because your words help build this community. If this video touched you in any way, click the like button. It's a simple gesture that shows that this kind of conversation makes a difference and allows me to produce more material with the same depth. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click it and stay with me there so we can continue drawing this map with care and hope. Thank you for being here. We're in this together.